It was my father that said that.
Well, maybe he was quoting you.
Either way, Elder Romney, he said it was quoted.
What about the 1842 or the Wentworth letter? This one is a fascinating and beautiful document as well. It's brief, but what do you learn from this one?
Well, one thing that is apparent in that is a, what I call it, a softening of the language about, other churches were believing incorrect doctrine as opposed to, we're an abomination in my sight.
And it was going to a different group.
Yeah, a different audience, and it was tailored to that audience.
There's a detail in this one, interestingly enough, that is not in the other three accounts, namely, not only was the true church not on the earth, but the Lord would soon reveal it or restore it, and Joseph would be an instrument in doing that.
Right.
Interestingly, that's not in our 1838 account, our Pearl of Great Price account.
And theologically, his announcement relative to the Father and the Son, that they exactly resembled each other in features and likeness.
Mm-hmm. Surrounded with a brilliant light which eclipsed the sun at noonday. We'll come to that in a moment. Just a quick comment. What if the critics who like to have at us over this issue of differing accounts and differences in detail even between the accounts of the first vision? What would you, Camille, how would you comment that? How would you
I think of immediately Paul's account of his experience of the vision he had of Jesus Christ that we get in three different places in the book of Acts. In
9, 22, and 26.
Right. And there are differences in details, and yet every one of them you can learn some additional kind of things like we've just seen from these different accounts. I think that seems to be very typical of real-life, first-hand experiences, and the audience you look at, who you're telling this to. We've seen different audiences to whom Joseph is telling that. I think that's I think a second example I think of are the four Gospels. All tell the story of the life and teachings of Christ, but there are differences in what is contained in them, and some of the details that don't exactly line up perfectly, but they're each given to a different audience. And we are wise if we tailor our testimony. Not we don't fabricate details, but we tell things that are appropriate to our audience, that would be meaningful to our audience at whatever level they are or their background. Yes.
Well, I would say this too, and that is Joseph is, excuse me, also learning what is important. That is to say, he's got it all together in his mind. There's no question about that. But as he is developing, things may pop out that become more important from the perspective that he is at the time.
Well, just as Nephi, writing the small plates some 30 years after the fact, has, of the occurrence of those deeds, has a perspective on that as far as what matters and what I think should be told. So with Joseph Smith.
Sure. Well, and if every one of the accounts agreed verbatim, one would become suspicious. That it would be that would be a clear sign of fabrication to me, rather than a healthy difference between them. Every time I tell a story, it may be fundamentally factually true, but I talk about different things and I tailor it to the audience I'm talking to.
We've dealt here with Joseph Smith's 1832, 35, 38, 42 accounts. There were others. Actually, the first published account of the first vision was by Orson Pratt in Scotland, as I recall. Is that right, Joseph? Edinburgh. Anything about Brother Pratt's account as told to him by Joseph that comes to mind?
He does some very interesting things. He speaks quite eloquently about the necessity of finding the truth, as it were. Listen to this language. It also occurred to his mind that God was the author of but one doctrine, and therefore could not acknowledge but one denomination as his church, and that such a denomination must be a people who believe and teach that one doctrine, whatever it may be, and build upon the same. He often reflected upon the immense number of doctrines now in the world which had given rise to many hundreds of different denominations. And then after that he talks about how Joseph did not want to trust his salvation to the fallibility of man. That he wanted an answer from the heavens, you see.
It's that account, too, that I think is so beautiful. The greatest fear Joseph had as the light began to descend, remember what he says? The great fear that the fire, as it were, would consume the forest in flames. So they were talking about the nature of the glory of God's appearance.
And he concludes this again, like that 1830 account, at some future time be made known to him the fullness of the gospel. And he says, after which the vision withdrew, leaving his mind in a state of calmness and peace indescribable.
Beautiful.
Beautiful description of the spirit of revelation.
Let's go. Yes,
I was
Camille.
just saying one more thing, that I think some of those details that are the differences between the accounts are ones that really are insignificant, and it seems like that they weren't so important. I get the feeling from that first 1832 account, he didn't know that how old he was going to be quoted for forever and ever. And it was around this particular time, and it seems like as it becomes more important in the church, that he may have done some more calculation and was able to say spring of 1820, but he didn't do that in 1832.
Good point.
He usually said about whenever he said that wasn't the issue with him.
That's right.
And in the first one, he is emphasizing the message of Christ. So it's not important to him at that point that the Father appear. Later on, it becomes very important for him to communicate the Father was there as well as the Son.
Good. Let's turn to Joseph Smith history. Let's read what are terribly significant verses. Richard, if we could have you read, starting in verse 15, and have you read through verse 17.
Indeed. After I had retired to the place where I had previously designed to go, having looked around me and finding myself alone, I knelt down and began to offer up the desires of my heart to God. I had scarcely done so when immediately I was seized upon by some power which entirely overcame me and had such an astonishing influence over me as to bind my tongue so that I could not speak. Thick darkness gathered around me, and it seemed to me for a time as if I were doomed to sudden destruction.
You know, at this point, we haven't said anything yet about satanic influence. If we begin talking in a few moments, as we will, about learn from the first vision, this is one of the earliest, is it not? He learns of the actual reality of a satanic being.
Yeah, he knows it.
Not just a force, but an actual person.
That's right. That's important. It isn't just some idea, some theory for explaining why things go bad. This was an actual being.
Yeah, let me read that. But exerting all my power to call upon God to deliver me out of the power of this enemy which had seized upon me, and at the very moment when I was ready to sink into despair and abandon myself to a destruction, not to an imaginary ruin, but to the power of some actual being from the unseen world who had such marvelous power as I had never before felt in any being. Just at this moment of great alarm, I saw a pillar of light exactly over my head, above the brightness of the sun, which descended gradually until it fell upon me. It no sooner appeared than I found myself delivered from the enemy, which held me bound. When the light rested upon me, I saw two personages, whose brightness and glory defy all description, standing above me in the air. One of them spake unto me, calling me by name, and said, pointing to the other, This is my beloved Son. Hear him.
From that account, what stands out in your mind as far as things that are theologically significant about the first vision?
There are a host of things here, but I need to point this out to you. What was the first word spoken by God in this dispensation?
Calling Joseph by
Your
name.
Joseph. Is that not a perfect way to begin a dispensation?
We can forgive God.
No.
But the personal nature of
there's
that.
two things that are important here. One is, yes, God knew him by name, by his given name, his first name, and that's the way every angel and every vision begins. It isn't, hey, Dean Millett.
It's an interesting statement about the nature of God from the very beginning.
Our relationship with him. But again, even to the finest detail, as you paint this great picture of the restoration, the boy bears the right name, you see, and it was prophesied that his name would be Joseph, this great old Hebrew name that means he who gathers.